Rules Committee will come to order, and thank you for joining us today. It's a opportunity for us to welcome not only friends that we have, but also to get back together. Judge, glad that you're up here. We had a little bit of snow and ice today, but we have made it. Today, the Rules Committee will consider H.R. 3442, the Debt Management and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2015, and H.R. 3293, the Scientific Research and the National Interest Acts. Recklessness in mandatory spending has placed our national finances and economy in peril. Today, the total debt subject to the limit, which includes Treasury securities held by the federal trust funds and other accounts, currently stands at over $19 trillion. Given the long-term outlook of historical high and rising debt, it is critical that Congress and the administration publicly discuss the drivers of this debt, its composition, its trajectory, and how the United States will meet this debt obligation in the future. It is wise management for us to consider what at least one of our members, the Honorable Kenny Marchand, who's the author of this bill, has spent several years not only pondering, but putting his ideas onto a sheet of paper. I might add that what we do know is the next time there will be a debt limit, it will be under a new president. And I don't know who that president will be. But today, this bill is, regardless of whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, what I consider to be wise, prudent management for us to understand what is a huge problem for our country and its future. H.R. 3442 establishes a new debt limit communication framework that enhances accountability, reduces disruptive risk, and returns our nation's focus to finding debt reduction solutions. That's what it can do at night to you, Mr. Marchand. At 3 o'clock in the morning when you're up thinking about this, you come up with answers. Specifically, this legislation requires the administration, whomever it might be, to appear before Congress prior to each potential debt limit increase and to provide testimony and detailed reports on the national debt, its key drivers, the explicit short, medium, and long-term debt reduction proposals, and progress on debt reduction. It focuses us on the debt reduction. This framework will increase transparency, and it's really about uncertainty. We will have more certainty related to the entire process where members of Congress and the American people will be able to understand not only what surrounds the debt limit, but the impasses and how we might approach it. The committee also today will consider H.R. 3293, the Scientific Research and National Interest Act. This legislation directly benefits the American people by promoting greater accountability in federal funding for scientific research at the National Science Foundation and ensures that that research conducted is always in the national interest. I think it's important that we're going to handle this act today because, once again, it's new and better ideas so that we can make sure that what we are doing is done with respect to the American people and policies that they can support. I'd like to welcome our first panel. It includes the gentleman from Coppell, Texas, the gentleman Kenny Marchand, who enjoys a wide agreement of people on this committee who personally like him, and yet others who've indicated they can't wait to get after him today. So, Mr. Marchand, get ready. The author of the bill 3442, as well as Congressman Bill Pascrell. So I welcome your testimony, and we'll defer first to the gentlewoman from New York for any opening statements that she would choose to make. We're delighted that Mrs. Slaughter is here, and looks like we'll defer to Louise at this time. Gentlewoman's recognized. Well, their first shot across the bow is one you could catch. Mr. Marchand, we're delighted that you're here. Mr. Pascal is around the corner, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Obviously, anything you have in writing will be into the record, and the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. Appreciate the opportunity to appear before you. Today, I'm here to present House Bill 3442, the Debt Management and Fiscal Responsibility Act. I introduced this legislation because Congress and the administration need to focus on finding debt reduction solutions. When this bill was passed out of the Ways and Means Committee in September, the national debt was $18 trillion. Now it's over $19 trillion. Debt held by the public is now roughly 74% of the economy's annual output. It's also at a higher percentage rate at any time in American history, except for the brief period of time during World War II. If current law remains unchanged, the Congressional Budget Office predicts that the federal debt held by the public will exceed 100% of GDP in 25 years, and this is unsustainable. Everyone knows the national debt is increasing, but the existing strategy for dealing with the debt limit only fuels conflict and fiscal irresponsibility. This creates disruption and uncertainty, and it erodes confidence in America's leadership in our economy. 5 times in the last 5 years, the Treasury Department has had to employ extraordinary measures to avoid reaching the debt limit. These maneuvers are supposed to be a last resort. They were only employed 6 times other than these last 5 years between the 80s and 2011. Extraordinary measures have become the new normal, just like record levels of debt. The goal of H.R. 3442 is to establish a new debt limit process that's more transparent, more accountable, and more timely. This legislation would allow Congress and the American people to take an early and accurate look at the debt before the statutory debt limit is reached. Here's how the bill would work. It requires the Secretary of Treasury to appear before Congress 21 to 60 days before he or she anticipates the statutory debt limit will be reached. Under the current law, that date would be next March 2017. Secretary would report on several items. First, Secretary would provide a detailed accounting of the state of the national debt. This would include the composition and trajectory of the debt, as well as the administration's plans to meet the obligation in the event that Congress agrees to raise the debt limit. Second, the Secretary would provide proposals on how to reduce the debt over the short, medium, and long term, and provide proposals. Additionally, the Secretary would have to address the impact that raising the debt limit would have on factors such as reserve currency status and sustainability of the entitlement programs. And third, if the administration requests subsequent debt limit increases, the Secretary would be required to provide a progress report on prior debt reduction. The nation owes $19 trillion. The debt is growing every second. Addressing the debt is a shared responsibility, and we should have the available tools to address that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Marshall, thank you very much. The drivers of the debt, you've spent time to think about this. The drivers of the debt includes mandatory spending. It's part of the entire bucket. We don't offer the advice on how to do that simply looking at the debt limit. But what would you anticipate that this report would say, and how detailed would it be, and who would they give the report to? Would it come to Ways and Means Committee? Would it come, because that's the jurisdiction here? And how would you envision that being done?
The bill calls for the Secretary of the Treasury to report to the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. And that can be done either separately or it can be done in a joint meeting. And it basically gives the Secretary of Treasury a broad array of opportunity to explain to the Ways and Means and the Senate Finance Committee how he intends to deal with the approaching debt limit. Not in retrospect.
Right.
Not through a press release, but beforehand. And the timing is left to him either 21 days or 60 days before that debt limit is reached.
Good. Mr. Pasquale, we're delighted that you're here. Obviously, you have been a friend of this committee for a number of years. I encourage you, when you do speak, and we're going to let you do that, please make sure you turn your microphone on. And Louise earlier said that she would welcome you and Mr. Marchant, so you have her best wishes, too.
Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this week the President sends his fiscal year 2017 budget to Congress, and it will be released, therefore, to the American people. In the past, this has included numerous proposals to reduce the deficit and grow our economy. The chairman of the House Budget Committee has refused to hold a hearing on the President's budget with the Office of Management and Budget. This is the first time in 40 years that the President's budget will not be granted a hearing. Now, it may not be much to some of you. I can only speak for myself, and that is it means a lot to me, being a member of the Budget Committee, as well as Ways and Means. I can't fathom this, Mr. Chairman, that this is not only an insult to the office of OMB, it's an insult to the President and the administration. Now, that may not mean much to you. It means a lot to me personally. Ignoring the fact that the President is going to be sending deficit reduction proposals to Congress and rebuffing the OMB director's request to testify, the House is instead going to consider legislation that requires the administration to submit deficit reduction proposals to come and testify about the debt limit and the deficit. Something doesn't quite add up here. I know I'm from New Jersey, but give me a break. What am I missing? This bill would also create new statutory requirements for the Treasury Department that are unnecessary and duplicative. The Secretary of the Treasury regularly corresponds with the committee about the debt limit. It provides the Treasury regular updates about the status of our ability to meet our debt obligations and the measures that are taken to do so. They provide us with the budget, the mid-session review, the daily Treasury statement, the monthly Treasury statement, the monthly statement on the public debt, the schedule of federal debt, and the financial report of the United States government. It's not a one-shot deal in terms of the relationship between the committee and these other functionaries, all of which are publicly available on the internet. That's good information for the public. Of course, that's who we serve. If the Treasury Department were to generate a new report on the debt limit, it should focus on the most pressing issue, the catastrophic consequences of a default on our obligations as the greatest country in the world. H.R. 3442 makes no mention of providing Congress with such a report. I'd like to see that report, and I'm sure many of you would too. That would be valuable. This would not be one-upmanship. This would not be disrespect for this administration or any administration. At the time this legislation was brought before the Ways and Means Committee, in September of 2015, Republicans were considering a default on the full faith and credit of the United States. September 2015. A default would have catastrophic consequences, including a collapse of world credit markets and destruction of many job markets. Should Congress fail to raise the debt limit, Treasury may not be able to pay veterans' benefits, pay doctors and hospitals taking care of Medicare patients, pay salaries to our troops, Pell Grants to students who need them. These are expenditures. That's not hyperbole. These are expenditures that have already been authorized by the Congress. But if we don't act on the debt limit, we simply can't pay them at all. We need Treasury's guidance to understand what Americans might pay the price first. H.R. 3442, which we're considering today, is a transparent attempt to shift blame here for a default to the Treasury Department, those rascals, which merely executes the decisions made in this body, our body. It is Congress's responsibility to raise the debt limit, to enable the Treasury to carry out the legislation Congress passes. It is Congress's decision to enact spending, raise revenue, and determine the level of debt. That's our responsibility. This bill would provide no additional information, would not get us any closer to reducing our debt. And fortunately, we were able to come together and suspend debt limit through March of 2017. We worked together. That may be unusual, but we did, and it worked. We didn't like it, everything that was in what we decided on. You know that? I know that. But we did come to some resolution. We're capable of it. The report triggered by this bill, H.R. 3442, would be wholly duplicative of information Congress already receives from the Treasury and the Office of Management and Budget. So much for government efficiency. In the past, merely delaying action on the debt limit cost taxpayers and homeowners billions of dollars in higher interest payments, cost our economy hundreds of thousands of jobs. Enacting a bill that signals that one side's plan to allow a default would send a disturbing signal to the broader economy. What we can, and I believe, Mr. Chairman, what we should do instead is to come together in a bipartisan manner on a budget. That's not a default. That's not sliding into mediocrity. That's what we're here for. I believe that we will instead see a deeply partisan and ideological budget from House Republicans that has no chance of garnering any Democratic support. Mr. Chairman, I conclude by saying this. This is a heck of a way to start the budget season. When you're not going to invite, and this is not your responsibility, when you're not going to invite someone to speak who's an expert on the budget that the president will submit today. I have never seen that, and you have never seen that, and you have never seen that, and you have never seen it. None of you have seen that before. Why are we doing it this time? I don't think it helps us get to the goal line, Mr. Chairman. I don't see it, and maybe you can educate me as to how we get to the goal line by adding all of these other layers of conspicuous nothingness. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll start with the education by saying this, that when somebody presents a budget that I anticipate will be $1 trillion more than it is today, it simply looks like we're beating each other up in Washington. And if the head of the OMB really wants to come do that, I think it was obligatory, and I would have thought they would have not wanted to do it. I'll talk to Tom Price. But, somebody presenting $1 trillion more spending plan should be on the hot seat and nervous. I think it was certainly beating. Let me go directly to the things which you spoke of, and thank you very much. I think it's important that we look at this and say that the Republicans, by contemplating ideas around the debt limit, we, in your statement, were accused of perhaps wanting to think about stopping the debt limit vote or not allowing it. I think a discussion about it is what Republicans were for I don't think that we were trying to shut down or have a debt limit that would not pass at all, but rather to use that as an opportunity to better our circumstances. And I think in looking at your statement, you'll see that we were contemplating shutting down this circumstance. I don't think is exactly right. Secondly, shifting blame. We're not trying to shift blame to Treasury because I don't know who's going to be running Treasury. This is not going to take place till the next administration, and in my opinion, today, I don't have any clue who's going to be over there. And so that's why I don't think it's trying to shift blame. I think it's really trying to be pretty smart and think things through so that we don't shift blame at the time. We do it before it matters to say we're going to do that. And I think then the last point that I'd make about the resolution of this debt limit, you spoke about it where you said these things may not be funded. These items in the budget, these items that are essential to the American people may not be funded if there's no agreement on debt limit. That's the whole point of what Mr. Marchand's trying to do, so that they come and do say, this would be funded and this wouldn't be, because as you and I understand, there's still money flowing in, and it gives the administration, whoever they are, a chance to say, we have evaluated it, and we have, under a break glass circumstance, here's going to be the first bucket that's funded, and here's the second, and here's the third, and here's the fourth, and we normally have X amount of dollars that comes in, and here's how we're going to handle it. That's the whole point of this, about resolving it, not shifting blame, not having a problem, allowing us to effectively work through this so that we don't get to where it looks like to the American people, boy, those guys up there just can't resolve their differences. I think what Mr. Marchand's trying to do, at least the way I take his bill, is he's trying to be wise management ahead of time when we don't even know what the answer is about who's going to be there. So that's my take. Mr. Marchand, you've heard his testimony. Would you want to respond back in any way? I would ask him, but I know he is aware of what you've said because he's been in committee.
Well, it's my privilege to serve Mr. Pascal.
He's a lot of fun. Yeah.
A lot of healthy discussions. It was the intent of my bill to look forward. It was the intent of my bill, and is the intent of my bill, that the Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance Committee get a deeper look at what the Treasurer, United States Treasury Department, intends to do when we reach a debt ceiling date. We usually pick up the newspaper and read about what the Treasurer has decided to do as far as extraordinary measures. I think the Congress deserves to know ahead of time what the United States Treasury intends to do 21 to 60 days before that debt ceiling is reached. We did put the date out to where it would not cast any kind of doubt over current administration. The truth is, if you look back over the debt ceiling issue, it covers 3 or 4 different administrations. And we're simply trying to add a tool to our tool chest to make Congress more aware so it can be better equipped to make that decision.
Mr. Pascal?
I have the greatest respect, not just in word, but in deed, with Mr. Marchand. But I have some problems if I know that the Treasury is providing information, certainly through the internet. We know a budget is posted. There are regular dates about the status of our ability to meet our debt obligations. That's not just thrown on us at the last second. And what measures the Treasury has taken to make sure we fulfill our obligations and responsibilities. So therefore, you have the daily Treasury statement. You've seen that. The monthly Treasury statement. The monthly statement of public debt, which I think is a very critical critical document, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Marchand. Very critical document, very revealing what that document is. In other words, this is not just thrust on us at the last moment. And what I would rather do, this is my opinion, is that we collaborate on whatever discussions we're going to have during any parts of this process, so that we can move forward, hopefully, together. I'm not questioning Mr. Marchand's motivations at all. I think it is a worthy discussion, by the way. Not just because I'm here as part of it, but because I think this is something we need to think about. And what I am trying to avoid is an extra level, an extra part of the process that I believe is duplicative. Now, you may not think it's duplicative. You may think that there's not enough information in all of those reports that we're getting during the year. And it would seem to me, and particularly on your side of the aisle, you've talked about cutting down the bureaucracies, and I agree with it, rather than adding to it. And if there was some way we could do what you're suggesting without adding to that process, I mean, you change the dates on when this is all due also. Because we're talking about March 14th in 2017. You're not talking about the time just before we have to decide whether what we're gonna do with the debt and whether we're gonna decide to pay it or not. So that's a little different also. I think even on that, we can bring in some compromises and work it together. I just think it's an extra added attraction, and I don't think we need that at this particular time. And as for not inviting the OMB director not to come and discuss the president's budget, that's different to my ears. We've never done that before. It may be a great idea, but it's come out of the blue. I don't think that helps us get the point that we want to get working together. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we never get to the goal line together. And that's one of the reasons why never we get to the goal line. And we have this hanging over our heads all the time about the budget, and then we get an omnibus bill, and everything is in there but the kitchen sink. And we anger people. This 40, 50 people that voted against that, Mr. Chairman, some of them had great reason to vote against it. Because it was far from the center core of what we're going to do, what we're voting for, what we're trying to avoid. And I would ask that we have a second thought about this bill.
Well,
Thank you.
I appreciate it. I would just say this. I think this last debt limit was delayed 3 or 4 months because of extraordinary measures. All of a sudden, a whole bunch of more money came in. You can read all the daily reports you want, but they couldn't even get within really 40 days of predicting. I don't think.
And Mr. Chairman, it was 7 months.
7 months.
7 months after it was announced
thought it
that
would
we
happen.
were going to reach the debt ceiling. And
It shouldn't depend on, excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
No, this is the dialogue.
Through Mr. Marchand. It shouldn't depend upon, it would seem to me, whether we're going to pass a budget at the end, whether we're going to increase the debt limit. It would seem to me we have a pretty good feel about that month after month after month. We know we have obligations. We know we got to pay those obligations. We may not like to pay those obligations, but we know we have to meet those obligations. I don't see how this gets us any closer to doing what we want to achieve. Maybe I'll have to stutter it more. So,
Well, I'll go right to
learner,
it.
Mr.
I'll go
Chairman,
right
but
to
I'll
it
learn.
then. I saw one day, I don't know the exact number, but one day, and it's happened several times under this administration, the administration extended the debt limit by hundreds of billions of dollars.
But we don't know that beforehand, Mr. Chairman. You know that.
If somebody would have to say, but it did too happen. It's happened several times. They all of a sudden in one day paid a whole bunch of bills. They'd been holding hundreds of billions of dollars of bills. I think that this is a wise question to ask them ahead of time, and we have to do it. I have to do it at my own household and other places. Are we holding any bills out that we haven't paid yet? And this administration admitted, yeah, they did, because all of a sudden the Treasury noticed several $100 billion worth of increase overnight.
But you
so
and
I think it's wise. And secondly, you don't have any clue, nor do I, who's going to be there And so that's why I don't think I armed you with as much information to help you, Democrats as Republicans, and I think that's why it's wise bill.
We certainly don't know who's going to be there, Mr. Chairman, but every month of the process, there's 5 or 6 different reports
Well,
that you and I, excuse me, it's not that it's withheld. I mean, if it was withheld, as some things have been withheld, for instance, on trade, then we have a good argument.
I'm going to
We
go
have a
find
good
out.
argument.
I'll be glad to go find out about those $100 billion that were written off the next day, and whether that was in, well, I'll show it to you.
Good.
Whether it was that was in the report and appearing in things as, I don't know whether the bills, whether we show how much has been billed that the government has not paid,
Right.
unobligated. Mr. Martian, do you know about that?
Mr. Chairman, all of the reports that Mr. Pascrell talks about are very valuable reports. And they're available to the public, they're available to the committee. What we lack is a structure where we pull all of those reports together towards a common purpose. And that common purpose would be, if we're going to reach the debt ceiling, we need to know at least 21 to 60 days ahead of time. The committees of jurisdiction need to have a intelligent, structured discussion around that fact.
Same page, everybody on the same page.
Bringing all of those same reports to one focus, and that is what will be the extraordinary measures that we use and what will be the conclusion. And I really believe that it will begin to educate members of Congress earlier, and it will make the decision about raising the debt ceiling less of an ordeal, because the members of Congress will be brought into the process earlier.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. And Bill, thank you very much. Mr. Marshall, thank you very much. Mrs. Fox.
Thank you very much. I appreciate our colleagues being here today. I also have great respect for Mr. Pascrell. We don't serve together on any committees, but work together on the Italian-American caucus and enjoy being with him. I think people know I have great respect for Kenny Marchant and think he's one of the most intelligent and thoughtful people that we have in this Congress. And the fact that he has worked on this piece of legislation for a long time before bringing it to me tells me it is not a spur-of-the-moment piece. It is something, again, that he has considered for a long time, that the committee considered some time ago, and that has been out there for a long time for folks to look at and make their comments about. I think it's a good piece of legislation, and I think it moves us toward people thinking much more seriously about what it is we're doing when we raise the debt limit, because it's an important issue. And I think one of the things I liked in the summary, I mean, the bill's very short. My goodness, really short bill, that the kind of bill that the public loves to see. And who can argue with this part of the description? It establishes a new debt limit communications framework that enhances accountability, reduces disruptive risk, and returns the focus to finding debt reduction solutions. I mean, that's what we all ought to be about, is finding debt reduction solutions. Doesn't say it's going to happen as a result of this bill, but we're moving in the right direction. So I think it's a great piece of legislation. I'm happy to be a supporter of it, and I have no questions. I'd ask Congressman Marchant if he has anything he wants to add. You had the chance from what the chairman's comments were. If you have anything else you want to add. Then I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter.
I'm really conflicted. On the one hand, I want to say I'm just going to wait till we have a two-house bill and spend the afternoon up here on that. Since most of the time we have here it's never going to go anywhere out of this room. So that's a little troubling. Second, as far as I've always known, the Secretary of the Treasury tells us that he's running out of money. The debt limit date is set. The House sets the date for the vote, right? Any part of the federal government that is not covered by an appropriations bill passed and signed has to shut down because we have run out of money. If there's anything else we need to know, other than I know that, remember that the Treasurer, Jack Lew, told us a little while that he had maybe 21 extra days, something like before he would have to shut down the government. But if the idea in the last fight we had was not to shut down the government, I'm not sure anybody believes that but the chairman. It was made pretty plain to us that they were going to shut down. We'd gone through one, which was pretty painful, and we'd lost a lot of money. $24 billion went out of the economy for nothing, shutting down parts of the government. So it's pretty well stated what we need to do. It's been done for 200 years. Mr. Pasquarello, you want to comment on that?
Yeah.
Am I wrong here?
This legislation.
It just
why-
says, what does it do? It just says to the Treasury, tell us 2 or 3 months ahead of time. Don't we know that?
No, well, it says something, yes.
We know
Yes.
we know the debt limit has to vote is coming.
Well,
I mean, it's not, we're not surprised by that.
No, I think the legislation is highly motivated, but I would add this. This legislation requires, as I read it, correct me if I'm wrong, the Treasury to estimate several things that only we know. For instance.
And that's our
what-
business, is to
yeah.
fund the government, not his.
What drives and what composes the future debt?
He's
In other
got no
words,
money that we don't vote for. So
That's
it's
correct.
really in our hands, is it not? Am I
if-
missing something?
If the debt limit is raised,
Yes,
that the United States will meet its
it's
debt.
obligations. They're
Obligations, right.
already
Both of
dead
these things
for.
are completely determined by us.
Right.
The Congress of
Because
the
we do
United
the
States.
spending.
That's correct. So,
So what is this for?
well, I think one could say we could try to build a better process so that we, at the end, are not throwing a Hail Mary pass sometimes. I understand that. But the information is within our jurisdiction.
I know that.
Members of Congress.
Yeah.
And that's why I use the word duplicative. I don't think that's too strong a word.
Oh, well, all right, thanks.
Thank you very much. By the way, I'd like to, without objection, into the record from a piece that is February 1st, 2016, GOP investigation, a Treasury misled Congress and public about debt limit. And secondly, an article, national debt limit increased $339 billion in one day, 11/2/2015. Mr. Cole?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These are two of my favorite members. We have a distinguished Texan here who was smart enough to get his education on our side of the Red River. So we're always happy to see that. And then my good friend, Mr. Pasquarello, and I serve on the Budget Committee together, and he's kind enough to bring me hand-rolled cigars from his district, which I enjoy greatly. And I've been exposed. It tells you how cheap the price is. So, but anyway, they're very, very good and very serious members. But I want to ask a series of questions really on 3 items. One dealing with the bill itself, one dealing with the concerns that, frankly, I share with my friend about the president's budget and testimony on that, although probably have a different take on it than he does. And then finally, I'm going to be an appropriator and chastise both of you Ways and Means members on not dealing with the real issue. But first, Mr. Marchant, to your bill, when would it actually take effect? Let's assume it's passed into Congress.
The effective date, it would become law, but the first trigger would be 3/14/17.
So it's nothing this administration would ever have to deal with, nothing this president would ever have to deal with himself. Is that correct?
No, it would be 2 months before that would be the earliest, but it could wait as late as 3 weeks before that. So,
But, and now this may be the most important question. Can you tell me who the next president will be?
I cannot.
Can you tell me what party that president will represent, if either?
I can tell you that I do not know with certainty.
Okay, so I don't think this could possibly have been designed as a trap for anybody because you don't know who you're going to snare. I think this is, I share my friend Ms. Fox's conclusion. This is a real effort to try and get at a real problem. And Mr. Pasquarello is certainly right when he says there's a lot of reports and a lot of information out there, but bringing it to a point in testimony with the Secretary of the Treasury seems to me to make a lot of sense, because I think it's pretty easy to blow by these things without people really thinking through the consequences. And not everybody does get to serve on the Budget Committee. We probably know more about this, those of us that serve there, than most other members. So I think it'd be helpful to the body. I think it'd be very helpful to people. And again, whether you're for or against the proposal, it clearly has nothing to do to try and either hurt this administration or set up the next one. It's to try and change the process, I think, to make it clearer and more understandable. Now, Mr. Pasquarello, in your statement, and you made a point I agree with. I don't know why, and I haven't, to be fair, I've not talked to our Budget Committee chairman. I don't know why he's made that decision. I know him to always be thoughtful, and I tend to be respectful of his decisions. But I'm like you. I think the president's budget ought to be presented. But I will point out this. Can you tell me the last time a Democrat actually voted for the president's budget? Or really? Because we've offered it up. We couldn't get a Democrat to offer the president's budget on the floor the last several Congresses, and no Democrat voted for it.
Well, that's the separation of powers.
Well, but that suggests to me it's not a serious document. If no Democrat, no,
I
let me
hope you didn't
finish.
interpret my no vote as I wasn't taking the president's budget serious.
Well,
Seriously.
if no Democrat will vote for it and no Democrat will offer it, it's kind of hard to expect the Republicans to take it seriously. It really is. And I mean, that's something that I think needs to be thought about. Again, if not a member of Congress on either side of the aisle will vote for the budget, is it a serious budget? I think that's a fair question.
Well, you could ask that, you say that of any president in terms of that light, what you've been presenting it. The president presents a budget to another branch of the government, and that branch of government independently acts yea or nay. And that's what we do, but we never get to the goal line.
Well,
the problem is we never get to the goal line. We never do pass our budget. Both sides say we're going to do it when they're in charge. Both sides have the best of intentions, but do we do it?
We're going to talk about that in just a minute, because I think you raise a really good point. I'm serious about that. But the point is, I mean, and to be fair on this, and to whatever the decision is, and again, I say this sharing your point of view. I would be delighted to show up at the hearing, but again, when we've had this budget presented several years and no member will vote for it, and this president will only be president for 4 months of this budget, it's kind of hard to take it seriously. And on our side of the aisle, and my friends on the other side would not agree with this probably, but I've looked at every budget the president has presented. None of them ever come into balance. They don't come into balance in 10 years, or you can run them out to 20, 30. They just never do. Well, you know, we may be right or wrong, but we did work with President Clinton to balance a budget. That was a bipartisan product. Republican Congress, Democratic
3 years.
Worked together several years, and both sides actually can be proud of that. But he presented budgets, and Republicans presented budgets, which did come into balance at some point. They would disagree about how. They ended up compromising, but those budgets did eventually come into balance. The president, actually both sides, you go back and look at what then Budget Committee Chairman Panetta had to say, both sides agreed we're going to balance the budget within 7 years. They had different ways of doing it, and they fought over those ways, and legislation was vetoed and compromises were made. But the point is they had a common objective. And I think that's missed in all this discussion. The president, for whatever reason, doesn't ever want the budget to come into balance because he's never submitted us one that comes into balance. So that does make it extremely difficult to take, because we clearly have a very different objective. And again, we had different objectives with President Clinton, too. But, we found, he vetoed welfare reform twice. We finally got the kind of deal that he thought was acceptable, that we thought was acceptable. We compromised, we made that happen. That's okay, but, because I think we had some common objectives. But for whatever reason, again, and I'll leave it to the administration to ask, they've never, ever wanted to submit a budget that balanced at any point. And I don't just mean in the budget window. I mean, you can run the numbers out to infinity, and they never cross. I just don't think that's sustainable. And that tells me the budget exercise is not a serious exercise. I'll give my friend a chance to respond, certainly.
My friend from Oklahoma, there was a big difference between 92 and 2000 and January 99 till this year. Two different, real different circumstances. There was more of an opportunity, perhaps, to work together. And I think you would agree. The situation was not as dire as we all faced in 2009. A whole different set of circumstances. Let me say this. I'm not as caught up in process as I am with results. And if I would take a guess, that's how you feel too. Not that the process is not sacred, et cetera. I just don't want to add to the process and make it more difficult and sets divisions in the beginning. It sets divisions in the beginning. President has a right to present the budget. You're not questioning that. We have a right to go up or down on that. And we have a right to put our budget together and vote up or down against it also. And never the twain shall meet. This is why they come together and try to present a budget that we could all accept. That's not easy.
Well, I agree with almost everything my friend said. I'm not sure we ever really try on either side to present a budget that we can all accept. I've never seen Republicans vote for a Democratic
Well,
budget.
you were in the Congress in 2000, 98, 99, and 2000.
But usually
those
the
3
initial-
years, we balanced the budget.
Well, no, we did, and you can still get there, but usually the initial budget document's pretty much a statement of the majority that they believe, and the minority offers their budget.
But the constraints were not the
But
same.
my friend is exactly right. The constraints weren't the same. And it's one of the reasons why this is a more difficult challenge on either side of the question. Look, in the 1990s, the baby boomers were probably at their peak earning period. Now they're retiring at $10,000 a day, going on to Medicare and Social Security. In the middle 1990s, we were at peace. We are not at peace now, and we are not going to be at peace in the foreseeable future. And with all due respect to the people that were here in that period, and I think they did great work, I don't think anybody really understood they were going to run into an internet revolution that created capital gains taxes like nobody's business. And that's not a predictable item. We had a happy set of circumstances, but we also had a lot of hardworking members and a president that actually agreed on the common goal. We're going to balance the budget and we're going to work toward it. And they did it. And I'm not sure we certainly don't have as favorable conditions. And my friend is exactly right about some of the crises the country faced in 2008 and 2009. But, I think we've lost that commonality of purpose. We had the purpose that we were going to balance on both sides of the aisle. We disagreed pretty sharply. I'm not talking about my friends in the Congress. They'll offer their own budget, and I'll make a judgment about that when they do. But the president's never had that same purpose, in my view. At least has never presented a budget that at any point he could argue would theoretically come into balance. That's a problem, and that's one of the roots of the budget wars here.
Theoretically, the budgets that were presented during the Ryan years didn't balance either.
Actually, it did.
Well, that was
Sitting on that
debatable.
committee.
That was debatable on what money was being used in terms of the Affordable Care Act. We had an honest debate about those kinds of things. I'm not saying this to criticize Mr. Ryan.
I know you're not.
What I'm saying is that the circumstances are different. For instance, if the President Obama in 2009 said we're going to balance the budget within 3 or 4 years, I think that would have been tremendously foolish in terms of the social cultural pressures at that time on what we could spend and what needed to be spent. Private enterprise wasn't spending it. Somebody had to keep as in all other recessions during the 20th century and the 21st century, somebody has to keep the ball rolling to whatever limits we place on ourselves. I think we need to relook at all of those things. I think they're important.
Well, I think my friend makes a very good point, and I don't disagree with that at all in terms of the difficulty of balancing the budget, and it might not have been possible in 3 or 4 years. It wasn't possible the last time. We thought it would take 7. We got it done, I think, in 5, but again, happy accident of the internet revolution had a lot to do with that. But again, I think if you got to announce this is our goal, is to sometime balance, and I think that's what Democrats in the 1990s thought. I'm not sure that that's what at least the president thinks today, and he certainly never indicated that's an important thing because he's never issued a document that at any point would achieve that. So that's a difference of opinion between the two parties, but that's going to make the budget wars that more intense. At least in the past, we had a common objective. I don't think that exists today. But now I'm going to switch to another line of questioning just real quickly. The chairman's been very generous, and I'm going to put on my appropriators hat, and I'm going to beat up on you both on a bipartisan basis. We are spending less money in the discretionary budget today than we were in 2008 when George was W. And that's been a difficult thing to achieve. As a matter of fact, even after the, quote, compromise in the latest budget agreement, which was hard fought, and I voted for it. It's a tough pill for a lot of people to swallow. If you look at the discretionary budget after the omnibus, after the budget agreement that we came to, we're still spending less money than Paul Ryan's budget, on discretionary spending, than Paul Ryan's budget said we'd be spending in 2011 at this point. So we've actually done better than the ultimate budget hawk thought we could do on the discretionary side. And that's, there's a lot of worthy programs there. There's defense of the country.
And through the chair, we're spending less on that discretionary budget in relationship to the gross domestic product than 60 years ago.
That's true.
So,
of course, you have to remember.
We got to put things into perspective here.
Well, you do. And one of the perspectives is 60 years ago, we didn't have Medicare or Medicaid. So, if you look at the percentage of national wealth or all other measures, we're really not, we've got a growing set of entitlements. And this is the frustration I have as an appropriator. We get a number, we live within the number. Whatever it is, that's the number. And if we have to make tough decisions, and we've demonstrated that on a bipartisan way, and made some very tough decisions. And what I would, in a bipartisan way, challenge you, and frankly the next president too, regardless, is we all know almost 70% of all spending is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, I think maybe food stamps. That's 70%. So you're not going to balance the budget on the 30 over here on discretionary. But we've got to have real entitlement reform. Now, my friend, now the Speaker, formerly Chairman, has presented a Republican set of proposals on Medicare and Medicaid. Frankly, neither side's been willing to belly up the bar on Social Security. I would commend you, I have a bipartisan bill with my friend Mr. Delaney that actually sets up a process modeled after, doesn't set up the solution, but would basically have a bipartisan commission that in a year would present a plan to the Congress. Congress would have 60 days to vote up or down. The composition of that committee today with a Democratic president would be 7 Democrats, 6 Republicans. If you had a Republican president next time, but you'd have to have at least 9 votes to get it out. So it'd have to be bipartisan, would have to come here, and we would have to vote. And we don't dictate, although I got a pretty good idea of what the measures would be, and they would be equally unpalatable to people on both sides. But you would save Social Security at the end of it. Exactly what Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill did working together in 1983. That's why this is modeled. So there's a way to get there. But I would just ask those of you on Ways and Means, Republican or Democrat, start putting forward entitlement reform bills. I mean, real bills. The appropriators put forward real appropriations bills that live within the numbers. And I've heard a lot of people posture, and I do in the presidential campaign. The only guy that I've heard, and I don't say this supporting because I'm not supporting any campaign, the only guy I've heard talk about entitlements in a real way is Chris Christie, who's actually had the guts to put some pretty tough things out there. I don't hear much of it, frankly, on the Democratic side. I hear a lot of proposals for more spending, but no proposals on how we're going to pay for what we got, let alone additional. And on our side, I hear a lot of candidates saying, you can have everything you've got, don't worry. We have, That's not true. My friend and I sit on the Budget Committee. We know the Social Security Fund is in deficit now. We're drawing down the trust fund. Fortunately, that's there. We can support this for a while, but we can't support it forever. And we can't do the same with Medicare or Medicaid. We're going to have to do some different things. And so I would just, again, I'm on my soapbox here, that if my committee got to do it, I don't know if we would be able to do it, but it's not our jurisdiction. The part of this we've got jurisdiction over, we've shown you want to get tough, we'll do it. And we've got to have ways and means, and frankly, to be fair to you guys, E&C, Energy and Commerce, doing that. So I would hope we have a chance to start anew, if you will. I think it's probably too late in this administration. We're going to have a new president. That president's going to face a situation where the Congressional Budget Office is telling them the budget deficit, as we're going to see this year, is going up every year if you don't change things. I don't know any of them that'll want to run for re-election with a budget deficit on the rise. So I think we're on the verge in 2017 of entitlement reform, one way or the other, by one side or the other. And again, I would hope that you guys rise to the occasion and give us a bill. Let's start voting on things that actually bring the budget into balance. Yeah, I'd certainly give my friend a chance to respond.
To the chair, Tom, I'm just a commercial or a piece of legislation that is not yet bipartisan on Social Security. And I would ask you to look at it.
You look at mine, I'll look at yours.
I promise I will look at yours.
Mine's at least got Democratic support.
Yeah, I hate to be on bills that are just one-sided. I'll be very honest with you.
Well,
I've said that many times, not just today.
I know you have, and look, we've worked together on head injuries and some things where I think we did some really good work for the American people, and I know how tenacious my friend is. But this is one, and I say this as much to my side of the aisle as the other. You don't have a bipartisan bill, you don't have entitlement reform. It will not happen if one side thinks that they can ram it through on their own. Didn't happen for Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. They had to work together. It's going to take that again. So hopefully, new president, new beginning. Now, I don't say that as disparagement to this president, but we'll have both an opportunity and I think an absolute necessity to find that common ground. That I yield back, Mr. Chairman. You've been very generous. I didn't mean to go that long, but I feel very passionately about this subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman knows that what we're attempting to do at this committee is to allow our members and our witnesses, when they stay within the bounds of speaking plainly about what is before us, the opportunity to not only complete sentences, but also thoughts. And I thank the gentleman very much. The gentleman knows that, and I appreciate him being here. Thank you very much. Mr. McGovern.
Well, I appreciate you both being here. I mean, I think what's frustrating for me is that if people are really interested in dealing with the debt limit and reducing our debt and eliminating our deficits, then we ought to be talking about something other than this. We ought to be bringing legislation to the floor that actually does it. I mean, I'm sure I probably don't agree with the entitlement reform that Mr. Cole has introduced, because I don't believe that the way you balance the budget is by, lowering the standard of living for certain people in this country. But but that's a legitimate debate.
But gentlemen,
happy to yield.
just real quickly, look at it. And I mean this seriously. We don't outline how. We just outline a process to force Congress to face it. I actually don't think you would find anything in the bill objectionable.
Right. But I think that would be a better use of this committee's time talking about that bill than this. We ought to be talking about comprehensive immigration reform. I mean, we're told that it would reduce the deficit by hundreds of billions. I've seen figures as high as $1 trillion over 10 years. I mean, something real. We ought to be talking about these wars that we're fighting that we don't pay for. We don't even authorize them anymore. We don't pass an AUMF. We don't pay for them at all. And we're all content sitting back as trillions of dollars are being spent on wars that we don't seem to spend any time worried about the cost. That's a legitimate.
Well, gentlemen, I would just add wars that aren't even authorized.
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to get an AUMF before this body, and it's been a bipartisan effort, and we just can't do it. And I've even suggested that if you're going to go to war, you ought to pay for it. And if people don't want to pay for it, maybe you ought not to go to war. Because if you don't pay for it, you end up in the situation we're in right now, where we just add on and add on and add on. It goes on forever and ever. So I sometimes we forget that we're the legislative body, and this is where we control spending, and when people, get all bent out of shape when it's time to increase the debt ceiling, if you don't want to increase the debt ceiling, then don't accumulate all these bills. I mean, and we control that. And so this exercise, granted, it won't take place until the next administration, but, I mean, come on. I mean, this is not, if you're serious about trying to get the debt under control, this is not the way to do it. And we've spent a lot of time on this bill already. It's been over an hour. And I don't want to prolong this, but it is frustrating to me that we're spending time on this when I think there are a lot of other things that we could do that could get us to the goal of reducing our deficit and our debt, and we choose not to go that route. So I have nothing other to say other than the fact that, I think we could spend our time better on other things. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. The gentleman, Mr. Woodall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to serve on the Budget Committee as the delegate from the Rules Committee. You do learn a lot there, and Mr. Marchant, you may be able to correct me. We don't work as much on the authorizing side there on the Budget Committee, but I've heard a lot of folks talk about your legislation as being duplicative. But you require the administration to come to Congress and offer solutions to bend the curve on the problem. And I am unaware of any other statute that exists that requires that to happen. As my friend from Oklahoma pointed out, the law does require the president to present a budget, but it need have no expectation of balancing ever, of reducing the debt ever, and in fact, for 8 years, it has not. So what is the duplication? From my perspective, this is the only piece of legislation that would require us to sit down at the table and have the conversation about solutions.
It is the only legislation that I've seen that brings things to a focal point. One of the really important components of the bill is it requires the Secretary to provide proposals to limit the debt against GDP in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. I think if that was the case, the Treasurer would have to reflect the predisposition of the current administration. I think the Ways and Means Committee would get an answer as to whether the current administration, whichever party it is, intends to, in the short term, medium term, long term, reduce the debt, ignore the debt, add to the debt, and if they have any intention at all in addressing the debt. And that's an important component.
Controlling America's debt, I would argue, is a 90% issue across this country. Yet more than half the country, not once but twice, decided President Obama was the right one to lead this country. There's a disconnect between the kind of policies that you espouse that attract people and the kind of tough love that you implement that attracts people. I tend to disagree with my friend from Oklahoma that any legislation that confronts entitlements has to be bipartisan. I think it has to be led by the executive branch. I think it's very difficult to drive that train from here. It's not a Republican-Democrat issue. It's an Article I, Article II issue. And since we're taking the freedom to chastise our colleagues a little bit, I can't believe that everybody in this room is not supportive of this, if for no other reason because of the Article I, Article II distinction there. We ask the president to present a budget. In the history of the Republic, that deadline's been missed 19 times. This president missed it 6 times. 30% of all the failed budget proposals that have come to this institution, the ones that violated the law mandating that they arrive here, 30% of the time that's happened, it has been in this administration. And we only talk about that in a Republican and Democratic way. President Clinton made the deadline 5 times out of 8, as did President Bush. President Reagan. President Bush, last president, made it 7 times out of 8. If it's the law of the land, we should enforce the law of the land. If the Article I Congress tells you that you have to have a budget up here by February 1st or the first week of February as it is now, then by golly, you ought to have it done. And we ought to all be outraged when any executive ignores a provision that was duly passed by this Congress and signed by an executive historically. And we're not outraged by that. Your legislation, Mr. Marchant, is the only piece of legislation I've seen that requires that we begin that conversation, and we're going to lose the window of opportunity where we can grapple with this issue. Nonsense that this is about putting the burden on the folks who can least afford it. This is about putting the burden on the folks who have the most time to prepare for it. And with every year we fail to act, the number of folks who have more time to prepare for it, folks who are in their 40s like me, that number gets smaller and smaller and smaller. I have not yet seen a veto statement from the administration. Ordinarily, that arrives fairly early in the day on Rules Committee day. And so it gives me great pleasure to know that this might not be one of those days. I would disagree with Mr. Cole once again, agree with Mr. Pascrell. I do think there is a snare in this piece of legislation, but it's to snare the executive who has a unique opportunity to lead, no matter which party it is, to bring that cooperation that has to happen between Article 1 and Article 2 to get this problem solved. I hope this is a snare that we are able to set, because the beneficiary of that is going to be every child growing up today who may never fully understand the number of economic opportunities they're losing because of this crushing debt burden. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Judge Hastings?
Mr. Chairman, I'm tempted to speak about this measure, but I don't want to cause us to be here another hour, so I won't say one other word. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman, Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to add to the fullness of the discussion that we've had today, of course, I'm just a simple authorizer who toils in obscurity in the vineyards of the Energy and Commerce Committee. But I did want to point out that, led by the Congress in a bipartisan way, we did pass entitlement reform a little less than a year ago in the form of H.R. 2. And we dialed back $2.6 trillion in unfunded liability in the Medicare system. A lot of people said it wasn't nearly enough. Okay, I'm of the Ronald Reagan School. You take what you can get today. We'll come back next year with a different president and see if we can't get a little more. But it has worked. It has worked in this Congress. The president did not lead on this. It was led by the committee chairs of the relevant committees in the House. I would point out the Senate reluctantly followed suit, and we did get something meaningful done. There's much more to do, as Mr. Cole so correctly points out, but I just felt it needed to be said that the House has led on the issue of entitlement reform. We did not require the executive to do it. We could do more without the input from the executive, and when it's the right choice, the executive will follow us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Excuse me just a second, Mr. Pascrell.
Can I respond to my friend from Texas for a
Yes,
moment? Sir. There has been reform in one of the entitlements, Medicare, with the Affordable Care Act, in terms of how much longer it's extended. There has been reform. And I agree, I believe that the only way you're going to get entitlement reform, because it is a separate budget, is that you have bipartisan entry. The president has to lead. I understand that. I agree. But you need bipartisan support in order for it to last. So you bevel it, at least. We should have done this with the Affordable Care Act after it was passed. We should have come together and said, no, this should be changed. Let's put in legislation to change it rather than wipe it off the face of the map. That's not a commercial. That's a fact.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if I may, it should have been done before the Affordable Care Act was passed. There should have been input from both sides. Many of us tried and were rebuffed, but that's history. Again, I yield back.
Well, an opportunity would be tomorrow, Bill. I'll be glad to look at it. And I mean, we got rid of class. Class was like $180 billion worth of just complete fraud that would never work, and the administration finally figured out, well, they only used that to get the bill. They never intended for it to work. It was a fraudulent process from the beginning, $180 billion. Anyway, if you want to get together to match your whatever you want to fix, if you want to fix it. I've had a bill for 18 years. Gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think while I don't think even the chief sponsor of the bill says that this will somehow fix the budget crisis, it certainly spawned some great debate in this committee here today, which is terrific, and whether the bill is innocuous or counterproductive, I'll get to in a minute with our witnesses, but I want to briefly address some of the things that my colleagues on our panel said. I certainly want to remind my colleagues that there was a bipartisan budget that was placed on the House floor. I think it was the 112th Congress, based on the Simpson-Bowles principles. I was a proud supporter of that budget, and it was the only budget that had Democrats and Republicans both voting for it. Unfortunately, there were also 380-some Democrats and Republicans that voted against that budget as well, which shows the difficulty of actually moving the ball on entitlement reform. What Mr. Burgess addressed about this kind of out-year, somewhat theoretical, fictional entitlement reform isn't the real deal. I mean, we can all play budget tricks and say we're going to do something that saves money in years 7, 8, 9, but when it gets down to the authorizing committees to figure out how we actually run, in this case, let's say a Medicare voucher program or anything else, or how we're going to transition, nobody even has that discussion. So it's a very different thing to have a theoretical entitlement savings in the out years than it is to actually debate reforming entitlement programs. And that's the important debate. That's the one we need to have. I'm going to look at Mr. Cole's bill. I'm encouraged by his work with Mr. Delaney. I just told my staff person to look into that bill. I do also, and before we get to this, a couple people have said, who's to blame? There hasn't been any discussion of entitlement reform. I do want to remind my colleagues, this president has been very open to that discussion. He's been very open to the discussion. He included in his budget some changes to Social Security, which gave great heartburn to some members of our caucus. That was never picked up. I'm not blaming either party. It was never picked up by either Democrats or Republicans in this body to build upon that discussion of how we can secure Social Security for the next generation. I feel every step of the way this president has not been the problem on this issue. This Congress has. Not this majority or the previous majority, both parties, people from both parties, by not having the discussion. Now, getting to this bill at hand, unfortunately, I don't believe this bill, again, innocuous at best, detrimental at worst, accomplishes much. First of all, some of the questions here, and our ranking member, Ms. Slaughter, alluded to this, when we ask the president to tell the Congress the drivers and composition of future debt, the president, any president, would simply say, it's you. It's us. What's a driver of future debt? It's how much you spend minus how much you raise. And what's the composition of future debt? Well, that depends on what you and future Congresses do. I mean, it's not up to the president to do this, it's up to Congress. Furthermore, it asks for proposals of the president to reduce the public debt in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. If it's, and I don't believe, some people said it might be a trap. If it is, it's a very ineffective one, because it's one any president can point right back at us and say, by the way, it's your fault. The driver of debt is you, Congress. You're spending too much money and you're not taxing enough. Whatever balance of those two things they want to say is what they're going to say. So I would just go to Mr. Marchant and say, why wouldn't a president simply, and I don't believe it's a deliberate trap, but why wouldn't a president, a future president, simply try to point the finger back at us and say, you asked me the driver of debt, it's you?
I think if the Secretary of Treasury is willing to appear before the Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee and give that kind of an answer, I think it gives a direction of where the administration's attitude is towards the Congress.
Well, any administration's attitude, and we're not talking about this administration, we're talking about future administrations, they have their, but whatever Congress spends is the only money that a president can spend. So, I mean, it's the wrong place. So, I mean, there's a right place and a wrong place to have this discussion. The right place is the budget debate. And I don't think if we talked about a couple possible breakthroughs on that. This has very little to do with after the money is spent by Congress, whether or how much the debt ceiling should be raised. And so those are two, and the conflation of those two has not, in my opinion, been at all helpful towards solving this issue. And I want to go to Mr. Pascrell for a moment to talk about the difference between those two debates and how a budget debate, an appropriations debate, and even an entitlement reform debate are fundamentally different from a debt ceiling debate. Mr. Pascrell?
I think that, I've been here for over 19 years. And I've often heard characterized what the Budget Committee's job is or what the appropriator's job is. I've heard it enunciated many, many, many times. And it depends. It depends who the chair of the committees are and how he or she wishes to move in the direction of the president, whomever that president might be. I think it's a changing definition. I don't believe in the general definition of each of those committees, at least in my mind, how I've seen them operate. This is not to in any way minimize either committee. So I'd be careful about this. I don't think that this is disingenuous, and I do not think that this is an attempt to minimize anyone's role. I think Mr. Mershon has the best of intentions. I just don't think he can reach, and maybe this is the point you're trying to make, his goal. I'm very, very concerned. I mean, the administration can't invent money when it's needed at the end of a budget process. But if we know and if we read what the Treasury is giving to us every month and every quarter, we'll have an idea as to where it's going. We still can't reinvent the money, can we? I mean, it is constitutional also that you got to pay your debts. That's pretty constitutional, I think. Isn't it, Mr. Chairman? You got to pay your debts. You got to pay what you owe.
You know, Bill, I think you're making your point.
Okay.
I think you're making your point.
Yeah.
And we appreciate that. And I'm not trying to cut the witness off. We're going to have a couple hours that we can go after this thing, but.
Well, again, look, I think if this furthers the debate about solving the issue of restoring integrity to our entitlement programs, of bringing our budget into balance, those are good outcomes. I don't see how any of these procedural changes would do that. I would just finally add that the information we're asking for in this from the executive branch, things that are subjective, like the impact an increased debt limit would have on future government spending and the position of the United States dollar as an international reserve currency. Just remember that any chief executive would give self-serving information that furthers their own agenda. It would be discounted by most members of Congress, certainly members of Congress of the opposition party to that particular president. More valuable information, I believe, can come from the Congressional Budget Office, and even more so from outside groups that study this. So I would kind of rank theoretical information and input about the position of the United States dollar as international reserve currency would be subservient to whatever the political directive of a particular president is, and not particularly useful to us. I mean, I think we would know what they were going to say before they would even say in this case. Maybe you want to hear it anyway, that's fine. But again, I don't think you'll find that this bill in any way is terribly detrimental to the country. But I think what you will find is it sort of casts the blame the wrong way. It adds paperwork from a majority that has sought to reduce paperwork where possible, and adds, I think, does not further us actually solving the issue, which is the goal of what we're trying to do here, and I'm happy to yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, gentleman also from the Financial Services Committee, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was not planning to say anything, but I did want to ask the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Mershon, about, so the gentleman from Colorado just talked about how we spend too much. That's the whole problem. That's what somebody would say. Do appropriators get to decide how much we spend on social welfare programs?
No.
Does the Appropriations Committee actually talk about how much money we're going to spend on interest on the debt every year?
No.
Does the Appropriations Committee talk about how much money we're going to spend on retirement programs and other entitlement spending?
They may discuss it, but it's just a matter
Do they get to decide, I'm sorry, how
not to
much we spend?
decide, but just to ascertain what the amount might be.
So isn't there some value in somebody from the administration doing a real look about what the drivers are, not the people drivers, but the spending drivers in our debt, to come and have a real conversation back and forth? And could it devolve into name calling? Apparently everything in this town can, but doesn't it sound like that would be a potentially productive conversation?
I believe it would be a very productive conversation for both sides of the aisle in the Ways and Means Committee. I think it's one meeting. We're talking about one meeting and a vision for the future debt, and an opportunity for both governing jurisdictions to have a discussion with the Treasury about this subject and not the broad world subject. Secretary Lew will be with the committee in the next 2 days, and we'll have a broad discussion. You've been in those broad discussions, and if they're not focused, we rarely accomplish anything.
When was the last time you had a president or their administration of either party come down here and give you their plan to pay off the national debt?
I'm not aware of it ever happening.
It probably happened when we were starting to run surpluses in the 90s, but I don't even know if it happened then. It'd sure be great to have that conversation. Even if their plan isn't your plan, wouldn't you love to hear it?
I would, yes.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington, the gentleman, Mr. Newhouse, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Pasquarello and Mr. Marchant, for your lively discussion today. I agree with my colleague from Colorado that this has been a good discussion, a lot of good ideas. I would disagree with those that didn't want to spend any time on this, because I think that this is probably one of the biggest issues that we face as a Congress and as a nation. So I think it's valuable to spend time discussing the national debt.
I think therapy is cheaper.
Therapy may be cheaper. You know, what is the national debt today? It's pushing $20 trillion, isn't it? I think some of the figures that I've seen is that we'll be spending more on just interest payments than we spend on our military here shortly. So it's something that, you know, some of you guys have been here a long time. I've got 1 year under my belt, so you all know a lot more about this process than I do, and I grant that. You know, I hope one day I can say, like Mr. Pasquarello, I've been here almost 19 years or over 19 years, but that remains to be seen. But I do know that apparently what we've been doing as a Congress isn't working that well. And if we can do something to improve the process, to address the issue that you're frustrated with, I'm frustrated with, everybody back home is frustrated with, and actually very concerned about, because it truly is a threat to our nation, then I applaud Mr. Marchant's efforts to drive the discussion to something such that is so important. So, not really a question, Mr. Chairman, but I appreciate the conversation. I like the direction of where this is going, to get people around the table and talk about the threat that faces our nation. And I guess if I had a question, Mr. Marchant, isn't that what you're driving at with this bill?
Yes.
Yes. Well, with that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to weigh in, and again, thank the gentleman for being here, and I yield back.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I want to thank both of you for not only being here, but really your thoughtful answers about this issue. And this committee appreciates you. I think our attendance alone and questions, we probably could have gone on a long, long time. And I think that what we're going to do is find time on the floor, probably on Thursday on this. I'm not exactly sure what day, but on Thursday, and we'll be glad to get at it. And I want to thank both of you. Please be sure you leave anything you brought in writing for our stenographers, as it enables them a better chance to get down exactly what we did. Thank you very much. Bill, good to see you. Kenny, I thank you. Evidently, I was told this is your first rule that you've done. Well, gentleman did well enough to get invited back. Thank you. I believe that Mrs. Eddie Bernice Johnson, or is that the next bill? Is it Maxine? Okay, Maxine Waters, Ms. Waters, Ranking Member, Financial Services. Mr. Huelskamp, please come join us. Ms. Waters, please do remember this committee is delighted that you're here. Want to talk about the activities related to your ideas on amendments. And Ms. Waters, if you'll please know, and Mr. Huelskamp, whatever you brought in writing, without objection, be under the record. Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Slaughter, and committee members for allowing me to speak today on my amendment, H.R. 3442, the Debt Management and Fiscal Responsibility Act. This amendment would require any debt report or statement of intent produced by the Treasury, as required under this bill, to include an analysis of the impact of our debt reduction policies on the wealth gap and racial wealth gap. Since 1986, nearly half of all wealth accumulated in this country has and continues to go to the top 1% of American households. Additionally, as an increasing number of the American population is made up of people of color, wealth is starkly divided along racial and ethnic lines, with white households having 13 times and 15 times the wealth of African American and Latino households, respectively. The result is the existence of a record level wealth gap and racial wealth gap that has compromised the nation's economic security. If the middle class and lower class and communities of color, the bottom 90% of Americans, do not have the resources to vigorously participate in the economy, then economic growth will remain stagnant and the nation's economic health will be jeopardized. Despite this detrimental outlook, the wealth gap and the racial wealth gap have been largely ignored by Congress. Congress's disregard of these historic levels of inequality is deeply troubling because the wealth gap and racial wealth gap are not accidents. They are consequences of our own policy choices that have knowingly or inadvertently allocated and protected resources and opportunities for some at the expense of others. So until we recognize the role that Congress has contributed to causing the wealth gap and the role it must play in addressing it, we will continue to place the nation's fiscal health at risk. Therefore, it is particularly short-sighted to discuss economic accountability and fiscal responsibility, as we're doing today, without discussing the wealth gap and ever-growing inequality. My amendment, H.R. 3442, seeks to amend this oversight. In the event the nation anticipates reaching the debt limit, H.R. 3442 requires the Secretary of the Treasury to, among other things, appear before Congress and issue a debt report regarding the state of the public debt, as well as a statement of intent on how the administration proposes to reduce the public debt. Any proposals included in the statement of intent to reduce debt that includes cuts to spending, especially spending related to education, housing, student loans, jobs, etc., will all disproportionately impact middle and lower income Americans and communities of color. It is imperative that Congress and the American public are specifically made aware of these proposals and, more importantly, how their implementation enhances or limits the wealth opportunities to all Americans, including those that fall outside of the top 1%. My amendment would require the Treasury to include this analysis in its statement of intent. Furthermore, H.R. 3442 is void of any discussion of default and its consequences. Yet, defaulting on the nation's debt would have tremendous irreparable consequences on the economy that would again fall disproportionately on the middle and lower class and communities of color. For example, if Congress fails to raise the debt limit, Treasury would be unable to authorize payments to veterans, servicemen, and servicewomen and low-income students, all populations traditionally constituted of individuals at the bottom end of the wealth gap. My amendment would require discussion on default and its consequences on the wealth gap and racial wealth gap in any debt report produced pursuant to the underlying bill. Simply put, if the goal of this legislation is to have a public discussion of the drivers of our debt and to facilitate policy discussions to improve our nation's fiscal health, we must include analysis of how our policies and proposals are impacting inequality. To close the wealth gap, our legislation must begin to recognize that the wealth gap exists, and our policies must reflect an intention to eliminate it. So for these reasons, I would like to request that my amendment will be made in order. Mr. Chairman and members, I know that what I'm raising here is basically a new discussion. And it's a discussion that most people have not had the opportunity to be involved with or to pay attention to. But I recognize that sometimes we have to work outside of the traditional box and point to areas that need some discussion that may never have been thought about before. And so I come here understanding that, but but basically saying it's time for us to talk about why does this big wealth gap exist and what does it mean and how does it add to or detract from our economy, and how can we, as members of Congress, recognize some of the public policy that we engage in around this issue. With that, I would yield back the balance of my time, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Get down and to vote, and so that we don't miss them. I would encourage the gentlewoman to do as she chooses, but if she went down and voted, there's one vote that we've got, she'll make it, because we're not going to take a recess here. If you want to go vote and come back, then we will be able to offer any questions to you, or you can just wait. I'm giving you that luxury. Well, okay. All right, excuse me. Does anyone have a question for the gentlewoman? Thank you very much. If
Support her
the
amendment,
gentlewoman
Bill.
chooses to leave, the gentlewoman is free to do that. Thank you very much, by the way. As you know, we look forward to your next return. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Huelskamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to testify on my amendment. I had a little longer discussion, but I'll be very short on this amendment. Would require the Treasury to provide a weekly report, basically, of the extraordinary measures. As we all know, we set the debt limit, but somehow the Treasury Department sets that little clock we see on the cable news networks. This would just require a weekly report of receipts, expenditures, or use of extraordinary measures. Instead of having a date set months in advance and no more information, this would require, as we advance close to that date, the Treasury would again provide a weekly reporting of extraordinary measures so that we, as in our constitutional duty, can determine if and when and how we want to raise the debt ceiling. And I have worked closely with staff of the Ways and Means Committee, and they find this language acceptable. And so, Mr. Chairman, I hope the committee would make this amendment in order that would help provide more information to those of us that need to make this decision about the debt limit. And with that, I yield to any questions, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Georgia. I'll see. Let me just ask you, Mr. Huelskamp, is it an Article 1, Article 2 issue for you, the debt limit being in statute and yet week after week seeing it continue to slip?
I don't know if it's about Article 1 and Article 2. It's more about knowing what's going on when we make that decision, because I think the last time they picked the date months in advance and reference made to a recent report that perhaps we didn't have enough information, and that this would simply say, tell us what's happening every week, what's in those extraordinary measures. I've had frustration trying to predict, figure out what's the impact, because this can have an enormous impact on our financial markets, and we make sure that we all have the best information possible. And I think Congress should know the information that's being that's held at the Department of Treasury. So in that aspect, it provides information so we can make the right decision and the best informed decision, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. With no further questions, thank the gentleman for his amendment and his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If there are no further witnesses, this will close the hearing portion for H.R. 3442. In that case, we will move to our next panel of witnesses, which would be Mr. Smith and Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson. While our colleagues are casting their votes downstairs, we will take a quick recess, subject to the call of the chair. The committee will come to order. If the gentlelady, Ms. Eddie Bernice Johnson, would come to the table, we will begin with that testimony. Welcome very much. Welcome to the Rules Committee. Anything you have in writing, we would be happy to have entered in the record, and we welcome your verbal statement. And if I could ask you to press that, there's a microphone button there, the green light's slow to come on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let me thank you, and I can look around and tell how many people are listening. But maybe I need these.
You have the best of the group here.
Okay.
I can attest to you.
I'm honored to
Welcome,
come
Mr.
before
Smith.
the committee and delighted that I'm coming at this time, and my buddy is right here. Unfortunately, I'm less enthusiastic about the bill before us today. This bill, H.R. 3293, is the product of a long and unfortunate crusade that I think my friend here, and he is my friend, has led against the scientific research grants with funny sounding names. And that might sound a little ridiculous, but that's the way it's been. The majority solution to dealing with these types of research grants, many of which come from the social science or earth science fields, is to add a layer of seemingly political review to the NSF's well-proven and well-regarded grant-making process. Not every grant that NSF has funded has yielded a major scientific breakthrough. You may even say in hindsight that some grants were not a good bet. But what we have to remind ourselves is that every grant is a bet. A well-informed, rigorously chosen bet, but still a bet with no guarantee for success. Not all of these bets are going to pay off, but history has shown that enough will pay off to ensure that we have the next generation of innovations to drive our country's economic future. In fact, NSF grant portfolios had a far better track record in terms of return on our investment than any private sector investment fund can tout. The problem with this bill is that they presume to know better than our nation's top scientists what the right bets will be, mostly based on their personal distaste on certain fields of science. And I can say to you, Mr. Chairman, that there are some funny-sounding grants. As a matter of fact, just this morning, my newspaper had an article on one on the cockroach research. And that is a funny-sounding one. But what they have found is that cockroach robots can go into areas of great disaster and sniffle out, because of their sensitivity, and find things that it's not safe for human beings to go. And so this is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And I'll make my statement short. Did you see this morning? No. I'm gonna give it to you. I like it. What I'd like to say is, I do have an amendment, but what I'd like to see is open the process for amendments so we can try to improve the bill. I really do feel strongly that scientific minds must make these decisions, not us. We're not scientists, we're lawmakers. And so that's really why I'm here today. And I believe sincerely that my partner here, the chairman of the committee, feels the same way. He's been a little irritated with some of them. But when it comes right down to it, it's the scientists that have the responsibility and the knowledge to make these kind of decisions. And we've heard about the shrimp on the treadmill and all kinds of things. But when the research comes back, it is sometimes something that we are pleased that we've researched. This research was in the Dallas Morning News this morning, and it talks about why they decided to do the research on the roach and why they decided to do a robot as much like the roach as possible to do this work. It is this kind of research that really does draw your attention, but we really are not the people who can make that decision intellectually on why to rule out all grants that don't sound good or bring the fund grants that sound good. Every grant is a chance. It's a bet that we take a chance on that it's going to come back with something positive. And some of those crazy sounding grants have done as well or better than some of the other ones. And that's my concern about the bill.
And I know the gentlelady also has an amendment. Would you like to go ahead and offer your testimony on your amendment
Yes,
this time?
this amendment really simply says that it strikes out a section and it says, by itself, by contributing to a portfolio of research in that field or across fields, will be left to the National Science Foundation to do so, rather than us in Congress making that decision. And I think you have it.
We do. I thank the gentlelady. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill that is before us is necessary because the National Science Foundation today spends $6 billion of the taxpayers' hard-earned dollars to give grants to individuals for various reasons. And what we do in this bill is to say that these grants, again using the American taxpayers' dollars, should be in the national interest. I can't think of anything more commonsensical or obvious than requiring that the taxpayers' dollars be spent in the national interest. We define national interest. That's not a problem. We do not get into any shape or form interfere with the peer review process. We don't get into individual evaluations of these requests for grants. But when only 1 out of every 5 grants are being approved, we ought to insist that these grants really are of the highest level. That is to say that they are going to provide breakthroughs in innovation or technology or healthcare or anything else. We do not want to, I think, spend tens of millions of dollars of the taxpayers' dollars as we are right now. And I can give you dozens and dozens of examples. Just to give you a few off the top of my mind, one would be several $100,000 to study animal photographs in National Geographic, several $100,000 to study human set fires in New Zealand in the 1800s, tens of thousands of dollars to study fishing practices at Lake Victoria, tens of thousands of dollars to study lawsuits in Peru in the 1500s. You get the idea. To me, these are frivolous. Not to say they shouldn't be done. It's just that the American taxpayers should not be paying for them. If someone wants to get them done, pay for them privately. I don't think we ought to be in the business of providing free vacations for individuals who come up with such ideas. Again, dozens of examples, tens of millions of dollars. So the big development, as far as I'm concerned, with the bill is, and it took a lot of months of discussing this particular subject with her, but the director of the National Science Foundation, Francie Cordova, has now agreed to include national interest in the guidelines for the National Science Foundation. The reason this bill is necessary is because that could be temporary, that could change with future administrations. So we want to make these guidelines permanent and make the requirement permanent that all these grants should in fact be in the national interest. So I'm happy with the bill. It did pass out of the committee by voice vote. Clearly, it's not with unanimous vote, and there will be Democratic opposition, and I understand that. But I do think it's a good bill that's in the interest of our nation and in the interest of the American taxpayer as well. Look forward to your questions.
Congratulations on your work with the director.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you very much. I have the good fortune to know the director. We used to serve on the Smithsonian board together, and she's a very serious scientist and academic. And so if you've arrived at disagreeing with her, that speaks well of the measure. I just want to make one point, or ask a question, then probably make a point. While this lays out the standards and calls for an explanation, as you point out, we still have peer review.
Yes.
And there's nothing here where we would overrule a peer review.
No.
So I think that's a very important point for us to understand here. And I actually think this is the kind of thing that helps science. Because sometimes a title can sound frivolous and not be, or the research you don't understand where it connects. So I think the act of explaining why this is important for some national purpose when it's taxpayer dollars actually would long-term encourage more support for science, not less. And again, it has the added virtue of, I think, encouraging people to think through clearly, how important this is. And the fact that you leave the peer review process in place and that it would still, that scientists would still be making the decisions in a non-partial way, again, suggests to me you're just making this a lot more transparent and understandable to the American people and the average taxpayer.
I think, I couldn't agree more. I think, thank you for that good point. I do think it is going to add to the National Science Foundation's credibility to be able to brag that everything is in the national interest. There's another part of the bill I overlooked, but it goes just to what you were talking about. It actually requires that the summary of the grants be in understandable, clear English. And believe me, that alone would be a huge improvement. So we're trying to actually accomplish that as well.
I actually chair the committee where a lot of this funding takes place in labor, and we have these discussions with the NIH, and they're working to try to move toward this goal as well. So again, I think, Chairman, you're to be commended.
Thank you.
I think this is, I think long-term, this will strengthen support for science, and I personally think we need to be spending more money on this kind of research. But little clarity and a little focusing, I think, is a helpful thing, particularly when, at the end of the day, scientists are still left making the final decisions about how these dollars are going to be spent, not politicians, not Congress, which may or may not be aware of these issues, but people that are known and respected in the field. But again, I think the focus, and particularly the idea that it be understandable, that the purpose be clear, will lend itself long toward strengthening the goal. And I appreciate your dialogue with Mr. Cordova. Well, I'll call her France because that's what I know her as. But I think that probably was very helpful. Thank you. I certainly yield to my friend.
Sure, thank you. I agree exactly with what he said. And all I want to do is put an amendment to make sure that it's clarified. Because I work with the commission as well. And all we want to do is make sure that it's not the Congress interfering with the decisions, but the peer review. And it's not clarified in this bill that that's not the case, and I just want to make that clear.
I would certainly share my friend's concern on that, and I think it's appropriate that we not be the decision makers, and I don't think that's the intent here, but I'll be happy
So
to
my
look at the amendment.
you are saying that you will support my amendment?
I'm on the same hall with you in Rayburn. I'm going to be very careful here.
Okay.
You're my next door neighbor. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, I mean, the gentleman says that the intent of this bill is not to interfere with the peer-reviewed process, but the very introduction of this bill implies that somehow we don't think that the National Science Foundation is supporting research that's in the national interest. I think the National Science Foundation is one of the most credible institutions we have in our government. I think that the science that they do, which is the gold standard merit review system for deciding what research to fund, is second to none. And so I don't know whether the point of this is to try to have a chilling impact on the kinds of projects and initiatives they undertake, but I just would remind my colleagues that sometimes, as the gentle lady pointed out, sometimes titles are deceiving. A $147,000 2006 study entitled Accuracy in the Cross-Cultural Understandings of Others' Emotions was criticized heavily in the House as a waste of money. The study has since been used by the Department of Defense and Homeland Security to protect soldiers operating among hostile foreign populations and identify terrorists at airports. I'm not a scientist. I don't pretend to be one, and I do trust the peer review process at the NSF. And this is not the first time we've kind of delved into this subject, and I think we need to do so with great caution. So I'm a big supporter of the NSF, and quite frankly, I respect the research they do, and I have no reason to believe that anything they do is not in the national interest. With that, I would yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. Gentleman from Louisville, Texas, does not seek time. The gentleman from Georgia does not seek time. The gentleman any other member seek time?
Mr. Chairman, may I just add one
Mr.
thing,
Smith.
and to reassure Mr. McGovern, the very last sentence in the bill, it's only a 3-page bill, says nothing in this section shall be construed as altering the foundation's intellectual merit or broader impact criteria for evaluating grant applications. And I hope, like I say, that will be reassuring. The example that the gentleman just gave, that's one reason we want to have clean English description, a clear English description, because clearly that would be in the national interest, and I've never criticized it. But if you're helping our military personnel, our men and women who are serving, I can't think of anything that would be more in the national interest.
Gentlemen, oftentimes with basic research, you don't always know where it's going to ultimately lead. You have an idea, and sometimes it leads in many different ways. Same with medical research. So I just point that out as a cautionary note. And again, I have been in awe of the research that has come out of the NSF, and I would hate to do anything that would imply that somehow we don't have confidence in what they're doing, or that somehow what they're doing is not in the national interest of the country. If you have a question on a particular research project, you can call them up to the committee and ask them to explain it. And if it doesn't make any sense, then, then I think we have a case. But again, titles can sometimes be deceiving, and I just say that as a cautionary note. I thank the gentleman for that.
Dr. Cordova has said to me, we know we can improve, and she's talking about some of the examples that I've given, and that's why she has agreed to institute guidelines that say that these grants need to be in the national interest.
Ms. Johnson?
I don't know whether you've gotten as many letters as I have from the scientific community with much concern about the overreaching in the wording of the bill. I am not against what the National Foundation needs to be in terms of credibility and responsibility. But I do think that with just a simple amendment to make sure that this language is clear would be in the best interest. And the scientists, I think, where I've gotten a lot of correspondence from the research community in opposition to the language as it is now.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both of you for not only you taking time. I know, Ms. Johnson, you had to take a few minutes where you had to wait, and I appreciate that, Eddie.
Thank you.
Chairman Smith, thank you for taking time to be here today. It looks like you've satisfied not only the questions, but the time that was necessary, and I want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
If you'll please make sure you leave whatever you brought in writing that will help our stenographer, it would be appreciated. We now like to recognize the gentlewoman from Houston, Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, if she would choose to come and join us at the witness table. Gentlewoman is no stranger to the Rules Committee. We're delighted that you're here. Without objection, anything you have in writing will be in the record, and the gentlewoman's recognized.
I thank the chairman. I thank the Rules Committee for their courtesies. And, Mr. Chairman, looking at the configuration of the ranking member and chair, Texans love science. And I'm excited about the fact that there's a lot of science going on in Texas. I want to emphasize my amendments very quickly and discuss them as they're listed on the roster. And just make a comment that I certainly agree with the gentle lady that scientists have a very important role in making decisions on what is viable and what is not. The other comment I would make is the great admiration I have for the National Science Foundation for what they have done to change the lives of Americans. And I frankly believe that there is not enough investment, though I know a number was cited by the chairman of the Science Committee, there's not enough money invested in basic science. And it's telling by some of the strides that other countries have made. Jackson Lee Amendment number 5 replaces the phrase basic research with applied research because the bill requires an enumeration of specific outcomes, which is counter to the definition of basic research. Basic research is defined as systematic study directed toward fuller knowledge or understanding and has a valuable role. And my amendment just conforms to adding to basic research and indicating that the bill can be improved by using a criteria applied research, which is a form of systematic inquiry involving practical application of science. My amendment would support the promise that basic research is conducted with the expectation that good science should be the underlying goal, strengthen basic research, and as I indicated, I hope providing more funding for it. Amendment number 6 establishes a new objective of the research that may be covered by this legislation, which would ensure that research conducted is consistent with established and widely accepted scientific methods. Again, this is in the context of scientists making those determinations. Amendment number 7 establishes a new objective of the research that may be covered by this legislation to ensure that research conducted is consistent with the definition of basic research as it applies to the purpose and field of study. These are clarifying amendments. Finally, my last amendment would recognize when research funded under the bill includes the awarding of grants directly to or to have collaboration with underserved institutions, including historically black colleges and universities, Hispanic-serving institutions, Native American rural colleges, or post-secondary schools where 40% or more of the enrollment are students who are from the groups identified in the amendment. The history of over 100 years of basic research in the United States set the path to the moon, MIR, technology, cures for disease, computers, microwave technology, and smartphones. And it certainly would be inappropriate for us not to recognize the value of a wide breadth of research that comes from basic research. Several countries, of course, have moved on beyond us in some instances, and I would hope that as we look at this legislation, that we take into consideration the value of the National Science Foundation and its breadth and depth to allow a free flow of research. I'd like to conclude by saying my amendments are intended to ensure that the nature of basic research is preserved, because without basic research, the United States will be dependent on others to make and reap the tremendous economic rewards from the groundbreaking discoveries. With that, I yield back my time.
Thank you very
Mr. Chairman.
much. Does any member wish to engage our witness? Thank you, Judge. Okay, that's pretty good. Pretty good. Okay. Thank you very much. I hope you'll be rewarded by taking the time to come up here, and we appreciate it very much.
Well, I thank you, and I will not offer to put this in the record, but I would just like to acknowledge from the MIT Institute of Technology, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, from my good friend State, the future postponed. Why declining investment in basic research threatens a U.S. innovation deficit? So I'll wait to put it on the floor, Mr. Chairman, not to burden the Rules Committee, and depending on the results of your deliberations. Thank you so very much.
That's interesting, and I'm not trying to further the discussion, but the gentleman, Mr. Cole, had an opportunity and in fact vetted and provided in the latest appropriations bill that we just signed on December 18th some very valuable things that I asked him to look at. So I'll take this moment just to say probably that's true, but our colleague Tom Cole is trying to do exactly that for basic research with an idea that I gave him, and I'll publicly thank you again, Mr. Cole, thank you, because this basic research is important, that we learn more about intricate issues. In particular, this was directly related to retinal research.
Yes.
And Tom really took my idea seriously, and I think it will have a profound effect over time. As we move forward.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, number one, thank you very much. It's very gracious. And number two, this is an area of bipartisan cooperation. And we actually, while the overall labor H bill spent less than the president's original budget requested, we actually doubled what he asked for at the NIH. And he asked for $1 billion increase. We gave him $2 billion, and that was a bipartisan decision. So frankly, I'm hopeful that we can continue to make those investments and get back into what we haven't done really for a dozen years, which is a steady increase in investment in basic science and research. I'm convinced it will yield enormous benefits for the country.
Absolutely does. Let me offer my appreciation to all of you and Mr. Cole for your work. It's an area that I spent 12 years on the Science Committee. I moved to an area of great affection for me, Homeland Security, and I had to get off the Science Committee. But in the course of that, I learned a lot and realized that it is, I used to always say that it is, I was on it before the turn of the century. That sounds interesting, doesn't it? I used to always say that it was the work of the 21st century, science, and that it is, but it also saves lives. And I just think of the new mosquito, the Zika mosquito, and what we're going to have to do with that, the president's budget. So I want us not to diminish what we give for basic research. And my amendments, I hope, will contribute in that discussion.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The chairman now is looking about the room and not seeing any other member that would wish to provide testimony. I was gone for a minute down to votes. This closes H.R. 3442 and H.R. 3293. And I want to thank the members to their attention, the members who have taken time to come up and give testimony today. Chairman, now being in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 3442, the Debt Management and Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2015, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking member, minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part A of the report. The rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions. Section 2 of the rule provides for the consideration of H.R. 3293, the Scientific Research and the National Interest Act, under a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the bill shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill. The rule makes in order only those amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable with the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, and shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
You've now heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there amendment or discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee grant H.R. 3293 and H.R. 3442 each an open rule, so that all members have the opportunity to offer amendments to the bills on the floor.
Thank you very much. Discussion. I would offer to the gentlewoman that we have made an order about half of the amendments. Many of them were duplicative, and we divided them between Republicans and Democrats, but we tried to take all the good ideas.
Yeah.
In
Didn't take mine.
3442. Well, we,
Other than that,
yes, ma'am.
just thought
Further
I'd mention
discussion.
it.
The vote now be on this slaughter amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it, noes have it.
Call, please.
Gentlewoman asks for a roll call vote.
Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Stivers? Mr. Stivers, no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins, no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, no. Ms. Slaughter? Ms. Slaughter, aye. Mr. McGovern? Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings? Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Mr. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Chairman,
Clerk, report the
no.
total.
4 yeas, 8 nays.
Amendment's not agreed to, not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. Ayes have it, ayes have it. And accordingly, I will be handling this for Republicans. And Mr. McGovern for the Democrats. I want to advise the committee will meet at 3:00 p.m. tomorrow on Wednesday for the menu labeling bill. This completes our work for the day. 3 o'clock tomorrow, which is Wednesday, 3 o'clock Wednesday.